All right, I think we've got folks mostly filtered in. And so with that, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar. I'm Laura Linderman, Director of Programs at the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute at the American Foreign Policy Council, and I'll be moderating the discussion. I'm just making sure there was no sound coming in. Okay, seems like we're fine. Before we begin, I'm just going to give you a quick few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. If you're not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, you can do that at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute. And we also encourage you to subscribe to our Substack newsletter, which is also Central Asia Caucasus Institute at Substack. That's where we publish our regular in-depth analysis on developments across the region. As usual, we will welcome questions from the audience using the Q&A function. So you should type your question if you have one at any time, and make sure to introduce yourself when you type your question. So today we're going to be discussing a newly released Central Asia Caucasus Institute Silk Road paper titled "The Rise of the Organization of Turkic States. Is Turkic cooperation filling a geopolitical vacuum?" The paper examines one of the most significant and perhaps in the US and maybe Europe underappreciated developments in Eurasian geopolitics. The transformation of Turkic cooperation from a modest cultural exchange into a genuine geopolitical force connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia. And I'm delighted to be joined today by the paper's author and my colleague, Dr. Svante Cornell, who is CACI's research director and also co-founder of the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm. He holds a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from Uppsala University and is a member of the Swedish Royal Academy of Military Science. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, he's written extensively on the region, including recent books on secularism in the Muslim world and also an edited volume on the Karabakh conflict. So Svante, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Laura. Excuse me for my voice, which has been slowly getting better over the last few days, but it might fail me at moments. I will try to provide a quick overview of the main points raised in the paper, which is kind of timely given that just in October, the members of the Organization of Turkic States held a summit in the foothills of the Caucasus in the Azerbaijani city of Gabala, which was really a milestone in the rapid rise of this organization that is making it, I think, an increasingly important factor, not just in Central Asia, not just in the Caucasus, but in the broader region that's connecting the Mediterranean all the way to the Chinese border. Now, what changed with this summit was the clear willingness of the member states of the OTS, the Organization of Turkic States, to move deeper into cooperation in security and defense issues. There were other initiatives in terms of economic development, transportation, digitalization, sustainable energy. But what's really striking is how this organization has shifted from a relatively, as Laura mentioned, the relatively modest ambitions half a decade ago to a fully fledged international organization that we see today that is entering new areas of responsibility almost all the time. So a few questions about this. How did this process gain speed so fast? What are the implications for the broader region? And what is really the role of Turkey in this compared to the role of the other member states? Those are some of the subjects, matters of the paper. I want to start at another end, however, which is a note on regions more generally. But because I think this organization or Turkey cooperation in general is challenging, if you will, the traditional lenses through which our bureaucracies in Europe and America view this vast geography. As we know, Turkey is often part of the Europe Bureau of Organization. Sometimes it's also viewed as a Middle Eastern country, increasingly active in the Middle East. The South Caucasus is part of the European bureaus, whereas Central Asia has been grouped either with Russia or South Asia, depending on the organization or depending on the times. That's a broader issue we can speak about separately, and we have written and spoken about. The point is that Turkey cooperation stretches across these bureaucratic boundaries and that impacts what bureaucracies variously define as Europe or Eurasia or the Middle East. So it is parts of it are viewed by different bureaucracies, but I don't think the whole of what is happening is really viewed by all. Aside from language, and we'll get back at some point today to the issue of the specificity of this organization that is connected around common linguistic origin. I would also say that, well, what brings these states together is that they're stuck, if you will, in the middle of a growing global confrontation that could be termed a new Cold War between the West on one hand and the new kind of informal axis of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea on the other. And there is a desire among all these states at common, and not only these states, of course, and that's to not let this new Cold War dictate their foreign policy and not to be forced to side with either the West or especially not be a part of this subsumed under this new axis. Obviously, there's also the economic challenges that this new world situation has led to for largely landlocked countries, challenges to transportation and economic development as well that are in the paper, but I won't speak that much about it today. Quick note about how Turkic cooperation has developed. Obviously, we know from the early 1990s that there was a huge level of enthusiasm in Turkey about the expansion of Turkish influence, if you will, to Central Asia. Right after the EU had rejected Turkey's application for membership, there was this slightly unrealistic notion of creating some confederation of Turkic states. There were some, on the one hand, some very lofty statements made about, a Turkic world from the Adriatic Sea to the Chinese Wall. Very often there was also a kind of haughtiness in the Turkic tone towards these countries that was not always very appreciated. But we should remember that leaders like Nazarbayev, like Karimov, made similar lofty statements about the rise of a Turkic century. I think President Akayev once took it the furthest of Kyrgyzstan when he said Turkey is the morning star that shows the Turkic republics the way forward. So it was really a lot of words that came from all of the states involved in, to some extent. But in the immediate, towards the mid and late 90s, early 2000s, this did not develop in any meaningful way. Turkey obviously had large domestic problems, including runaway inflation, including its own internal security problems and the PKK rebellion. We also had gradually a turning of Turkey towards the Middle East and towards a focus on Islamic matters. But also, quite importantly for this, Uzbekistan withdrew, had spats with Turkey, and was not interested in Turkic cooperation. So for a while, none of the two largest by population countries in the Turkic world, the two largest, Uzbekistan and Turkey, were interested in Turkic cooperation, and that really meant that it didn't go very far. And it's important to note at this time that there were countries that pushed forward with the ideas of Turkic cooperation and developing it and branching it out. And the main advocates, the main initiatives were taken by Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. It was President Nazarbayev that proposed the creation of the Turkic Council in the late 2000s. And it was Azerbaijan that hosted the summit where it was agreed upon to create a Turkic Council. This was in 2009, if my memory serves me right. And it's important to note that there were really two, I think, factors that led to a shift from this relatively low-key Turkic Council into a full organization that's taking on a completely different role. The most obvious reason is that Uzbekistan, under the leadership of President Mirziyoyev, completely changed its approach to Central Asia, to the neighborhood, but also to Turkey cooperation, became an enthusiastic supporter. And as the largest Central Asia country by population, its geographic position as a historical power center in Central Asia, that was absolutely crucial. And equally important was that there was a nationalist reorientation away from Islamism in Turkish politics, which made Turkey a lot more interested in Turkic cooperation. So we can say that Turkey and Uzbekistan have come back to the fold, if you will, whereas it was Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan that carried the flag, if you will, of Turkic cooperation all along. And I'll get back to this point about how the different countries have been driving forces in a moment. Obviously, as I mentioned, that there has been especially in recent years, a very strong focus on the part of the countries involved to work on digitalization issues, AI issues, green technology issues, initiatives in the field of finance as well. Kazakhstan proposed the creation of a Turkic investment fund. There's been a greater collaboration, integration in response to challenges in the field of green energy, smart innovation, and so forth. And President Tokayev of Kazakhstan has made digitalization and AI the centerpiece of Kazakhstan's national strategy and its agenda in driving as it is the driving the Turkic Council forward this coming year. What really, this is perhaps not so surprising in terms of what the organization can do and in terms of real benefits in the economic field and so forth. Uh, but what is really, I think, much more surprising is how this organization has branched out into the security sector, intelligence, defense industry, and now there is even talk about military exercises and military cooperation. And here I want to make a distinction. While there has been a rise in a lot of types of cooperation among members of this organization, some have involved Turkey and some have not. And I think my view is that for a number of years, the organization of Turkic states itself did not necessarily involve itself in security and military matters, but it served as a platform for member states to engage in bilateral and trilateral initiatives in this area that would probably not have been would not have happened if the OTS as a platform didn't bring them together in an intensive way in the way it did. Now, there's no escaping the fact that Turkey is the biggest actor by far, especially in the security and intelligence area. It's true in the economic area as well, obviously. It has, more than double the population of Uzbekistan, which is the second largest country, and its economy is, of course, several times larger than Kazakhstan, which has the largest economy of the other states, and its military is also several times larger than Azerbaijan, which is the largest military power outside of Turkey among the organization's member states. Um, but I think, whereas that is the case, in terms of who has been driving the expansion of the OTS into the security and military area, I think it's been clearly, in the first place, Azerbaijan and President Aliyev of Azerbaijan that has been doing so. Azerbaijan, of course, is much smaller, but as noted, it has a more powerful military capacity than any Central Asian state. Again, it looks small on the map, but Azerbaijan's military expenditure as of 2020 was $2.2 billion. That was followed by Kazakhstan at 1.7 and Uzbekistan at 1.4. Now, of course, those numbers are growing. Again, Azerbaijan's active duty military personnel at 66,000 is also much larger than the other Central Asian states. So it's while it looks small on the map, like I said, Azerbaijan in terms of military expenditure and its has an outsized role. Obviously, all of these are lagging far behind Turkey with 355,000 men and 17 billion military expenditure. But I think what was crucial in the timing of the expansion of the OTS and especially its venture into security and military affairs was the Second Karabakh War in 2020 and the 2023 military operation in which Azerbaijan took over the rest of Karabakh that had been under the control of Russian peacekeeping forces. This was an event that followed on matters that had already garnered the interest of Central Asian states, namely how Turkey had fought, if you will, proxy wars in both Syria and in Libya with Russian-supported actors and come out on the upper hand while maintaining a transactional but fully functional relationship with Russia, not least because of Russia's, if you will, need of Turkey as a state that didn't join fully out the Western sanction, where they could park their yachts and money and so forth and go travel abroad. Turkey fulfilled a very important role for Russia, which means that Russia felt itself limited in how it could respond to Turkey stepping up in places like Syria and Libya against Russian interest in the way it did. Azerbaijan's victory in the war against Armenia was very heavily supported by Turkey as well as Israel. And this fact was very much noticed in Central Asia and made both Turkey and Azerbaijan attractive partners for the development of both defense industry, intelligence cooperation, and military cooperation compared to what had been the case in the past when these militaries had been more oriented towards Russia, especially since Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Today, and we published at our institute a paper on this by Rich Utsen 2 years ago, I think, on how that talked about Turkey's security cooperation with these regions, and he noted that all states in of the Turkic states in Central Asia and the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, are in some process of integrating their military, security, defense industries with Turkey. Um, there's detail about this in the paper. But I think what is crucial to mention is that all of this security and defense cooperation does not involve Turkey. On a bilateral level, especially, there's been, 3 sets of bilateral relationships that have been developing very quickly, and that's between what I call the 3 middle powers of the region, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, with Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, as well as more recently Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan. These 3 countries now have raised their bilateral relations to allied relations. They have created the so-called Supreme Interstate Councils to organize the cooperation between their governments. They have expanded military exchanges, engaged in joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and as I mentioned, the development of defense industry with each other. So there are parts of these that involve Turkey, and there's a lot of these types of cooperation that don't involve Turkey, at least not directly, although perhaps indirectly Turkey may be involved in one way or another. Most recently, of course, at the Gabala summit, President Aliyev launched the idea that the OTS would have military exercises, and we'll have to see if that happens in the coming year. Now, I want to turn to another matter, which is the widely circulated notion out there that the OTS or Turkic cooperation in general is some form of a Turkish plan or something, an initiative driven by President Erdogan. And I want to, as those who have been listening to me today and previously, I would like to make it clear that I look at it very differently. I don't see this at all as an initiative that is, so to speak, made in Turkey. Again, there is no going around the fact that Turkey has a significant role as the largest and the most powerful among the Turkic countries. But I would argue that the the perception that this is driven by Turkey alone is really going back to, excuse me, is a function of how outsiders tend to view regional politics in Central Asia. That is to say that the Central Asian states are some kind of objects, not subjects. They are the proverbial pawns on the chessboard. They lack agency in a world that is seen to be where decisions are made by larger outside powers. And I think this absolutely ignores issues that we've been writing about our institute, Professor Starr and myself, about the growing agency of the countries of the region. We released a Silk Road paper on this, I believe, 2 years ago, and how especially has been an emergence of middle powers in the region that are able to not only safeguard their own interests, but especially when working together, expand their interest in their regions, even vis-a-vis the bigger powers like Russia and China. So the key point here is that Turkey is far from the only power setting the agenda. And that makes the OTS very different in nature from either the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, which are Russia-centered organizations, or the SCO, which is slightly less Chinese-centered than the CSTO or the Eurasian Union is, but very still clearly a project that is centered on China. And which you have, of course, in its name because it's named after Shanghai, the largest city in China, where its organization is headquartered. As for the organization of Turkic states, my conclusion is that if you look at the major initiatives, both in how the organization itself was created, again with Kazakhstan taking the initiative for the creation of the Turkic Council, and now taking the initiative in driving the OTS into cutting-edge technological matters. That's Kazakhstan's initiative, nobody else. And if you look at the expansion of the OTS into the security and military field, you see how Azerbaijan is clearly taking the lead in that over the past several years. And again, this is, I would argue that incomparably to most other regional arrangements, with the sole exception, I would say, of the Central Asian presidential summits, the OTS is a relationship of equals. The enthusiasm, if you look at, for example, organizations like the CSTO or the Eurasian Union, you don't find an equal level of enthusiasm among member states. You found very much a reluctance among member states, even in joining or remaining members of these organizations. And you find, if we talk about the CSTO, how some, like Uzbekistan, even left the organizations because they found that it was not in their interest. Now, everybody doesn't have the ability to do that. I think several would like to if they could. But I think we see in the case of the OTS that there is a true enthusiasm on the part of the member states for developing this form of cooperation. Obviously, and turning to another very important matter is again this issue of linguistic emphasis on Turkicness. It is legitimately a key criticism of the OTS and of Turkic cooperation in general that it is ethnic based in nature and therefore to some extent exclusive. The obvious question is, well, what about if you're Tajikistan? What if you're Georgia? What if you're Armenia? What is your role in this? There's an emphasis, if you look at the documents on the OTS, there's an emphasis on Turkic unity, and there are references to past glory and present brotherhood among the Turkic states. Could this prove counterproductive in terms of how the OTS and the Turkic states approach their non-Turkic neighbors? What does this mean, for example, for the Central Asian 5, now Central Asian 6 format of cooperation where Tajikistan is included? Are these complementary to each other, or is there a conflict here? Acknowledging all this, I would like to say first that if Hungary is included as a Turkic speaking state, that suggests to me that there is a relatively wide area of interpretation of what defines you as a Turkic state. I would also mention that Georgia has, for practical purposes, already been included in concrete cooperation within the framework of the OTS and Customs Administration, for example, which is very natural in terms of where Georgia is located. And if you want to transport something by land from the Turkic states of Azerbaijan and Central Asia to Turkey, you have to cross through, either Russia, Georgia, Armenia, or Iran, and Georgia has been the main corridor. We also see that while not happening in the formal context of the OTS, there was, for example, recently a military exercise held in Uzbekistan with 5 countries participating. 4 of them were Turkic states: Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan. The 5th member that participated was Tajikistan. So there is, and has been, especially since the improvement in relations between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and the resolution of the border dispute between these countries, a much more of a cooperative atmosphere. And I think it's not a coincidence that the OTS at the recent summit adopted a format called the OTS Plus, which is hopefully will lead to a way to organizing the OTS's relationship with the non-Turkic states. Obviously, this involves the states that are in the region. It could also be outside powers like Pakistan, for example, that has been very much supportive of this, especially supportive of Turkey and of Azerbaijan. And there may be others. In order to not take too much of your time, I'd like to just conclude by a couple of takeaways from the paper. And the first and main takeaway, I would argue, is that while it's happened very fast in terms of how fast it has been expanding, Turkey cooperation is now intensifying so rapidly that it can no longer be ignored. That's the first point. And the second point is that I would argue that very much while we may have issues with some details, the main lines of what's happening in Turkey cooperation is directly in line with American and European policy objectives in Central Asia and the Caucasus. What they are doing is complementary to Western policies, and it is also obvious that Turkic cooperation is filling a void that Western powers themselves have proven either unwilling or unable to fill. For example, if Western powers, such as the United States, had been involved so directly in security and military matters or defense industrial matters in this region, that would probably have been something the countries involved would have thought more than twice about because of the likelihood of a strong response by either the Chinese or the Russians, or for that matter, the Iranians. But when Turkey is willing to do this, it has so far seemed able to do this without attracting a major reaction from any of these outside powers. Whether that will be the case forever, we don't know. But I think it's an important point that they have been willing and able to do what the NATO, with the exception of the Partnership for Peace, which was a very solid initiative, but is languished to some extent. We haven't been able to fill that role. Obviously, the Turkey cooperation is also a leading force, advancing the East-West trade and transport corridor, which has been something that the since back to the Clinton or first George H.W. Bush administration was an American priority. But I don't know if those executive orders have been relinquished yet. But for a long time, the U.S. couldn't even get involved in discussions about east-west transport when it came to fossil fuels, whether natural gas or oil, as a result of climate change initiatives by the Biden administration. The OTS doesn't have this problem, and it can take a lead in advancing the corridor. Of course, there are reservations that the Western countries have about the OTS, about Turkey cooperation. There is the ethnic character of the organization. There is the perception of this being a Turkish project, and the frequent anti-Western statements made by President Erdogan that don't seem to be congruent with the notion that what this organization is actually doing is very much very much in parallel to Western interests. And there is, especially on the part of the European Union, a red flag in terms of the observer status that the Turkish, self-proclaimed Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has within the OTS. So these are all factors that have been limiting Western engagement with the OTS. But the takeaway from at least my research on this is that none of this should obscure the clear alignment of interest that is at play between what we want to see in Central Asia and the Caucasus and what is happening under the leadership of this organization. And that it's time we recognize that and find ways to engage with this rather than remaining passive bystanders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Svante. And there's really a lot of different areas we could dig in a bit more. And I would like to just recommend anybody submit Q&A questions that they might have. I have one. You've made a very compelling case about the sort of equality of the states involved in the OTS. We actually did get a question from Saudat Kasimova ahead of the after reading the paper ahead of the webinar, asking if it is. She's wondering if linguistic identity can replace the economic and political foundations on such a project, and doesn't it risk remaining symbolic if it doesn't have a real center of power, such as Germany, France, and the EU, or Russia, China, as in the SCO? So does it need a real center of power, or will it just remain sort of symbolic in action?
I think, first of all, the interesting thing about the linguistic identity is that it's partly theoretical. And why I say that is because you don't have a common language at present among the members of the Organization of Turkic States. I speak about this to some extent in the paper, and having lived in Turkey when the first batches of Central Asian students came to the country, it was fascinating to see that when they first came to Turkey, they couldn't understand what people were saying, but within 3 months, they were able to take classes in Turkish. So these languages are close, but there are also significant differences, so that, a Kyrgyz speaker wouldn't, or a Kazakh speaker wouldn't automatically understand a Turkish speaker. It's a little bit similar to, we joke about it because in Nordic cooperation, we have the same situation where Finland is kind of Tajikistan, if you will, speaking a different language, but they have Swedish as an official language. But, very often meetings some communication is done in English, because even between Swedes and Danes, we don't always understand each other if we haven't, had a lot of exposure to the other language. So to some extent, this linguistic identity is theoretical, because they don't, when they speak to each other, yes, the Azerbaijanis and the Turks can speak freely to each other, but that's not the case with everybody. So now you have simultaneous translation going on in all the different Turkic languages. What's going to happen in the future? I don't know. Will there be a Turkic Esperanto? Perhaps not. But will there be a greater understanding of each other's languages? Probably. But to the extent that this linguistic identity is typical of an imagined community, which, by the way, most modern nation states are as well. So, to my mind, the answer to the question is, um, I think there is enough of a right now a common sense of identity, which is, I think, also animated by a sense of insecurity and a sense of that this is a threatening world with powers around that don't necessarily wish us well. It is, I think, very much congruent with the general sense of cooperation, the cooperative environment that's emerged in Central Asia as a whole, where countries are feeling that, where we either sink or swim together. Um, what I would say is that perhaps the role of Turkey is enough. Why is the role of Turkey important? And if you will, why is Turkey what makes the, if you will, why do we even need the organization of Turkic states? Again, it doesn't include all the countries, it's ethnic based. Well, I think it is because it's the only organization that on a voluntary basis, rather than imposed from the outside, has shown the ability to bring in an external regional power that still, to some extent, perhaps learning from past mistakes, is treating the other countries as equals. That's the role that Turkic cooperation plays, to my mind. Now, the other question is, and many of our listeners will know more about this than we do, or certainly than I do. What is the sense of Turkic identity and solidarity among these countries? It's going to be very different. If you look at Azerbaijan, I would say that this is now almost a national ideology coming from the bottom of pan-Turkism. I don't think that's the same thing in Central Asia. We see in Uzbekistan it wasn't. Now I think it's rapidly expanding as a sense of identity and solidarity. How far will it go? How does it compare with national separate identities? Those are all questions that will be answered in due time. Whether we need a France or a Germany, I think in Central Asia we have that. In Central Asia we have Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. If you see the love fest, if you will, that you now have between those two countries in Uzbek and Azerbaijan, I think we have, for the present moment, an alignment of all these states for what they want to do. How far will it go? We also already see that they probably want to pull it in different directions. If the Azerbaijanis would decide, you probably would have a Turkic military alliance today. I don't think that the Central Asian states are ready for that. So just as we talk about Central Asian cooperation, and what is the lowest common denominator? Bringing Tajikistan and Turkmenistan on board has been the difficult task for Central Asian cooperation. Turkmenistan, it should be noted, is still an observer state of the Organization of Turkic States. So we'll have to see. But to me, it seems that it has filled a vacuum by being able to bring in a kindred, if you will, state that is not perceived by anybody in Central Asia as having nefarious intentions on the region.
Great, thanks so much. So that actually leads in really well to two questions we got sort of double clicking on this ethnic character or potential for other places that could go. And the first is from Baktkul Chunbayeva, journalist from Kyrgyzstan, who wants to know, considering Russia's ongoing economic, political, and cultural influence in Central Asia, to what extent does this influence hinder deeper political, cultural, or institutional unity among Turkic countries? Additionally, how could the role of Tatarstan, an internal republic in the Russian Federation with strong Turkic identity, be understood within broader discussions of Turkic solidarity and integration? And to follow on to that, an anonymous attendee wants to know how the OTS's relationship with Turkic populations and organizations in other states like Tatars in Russia or Uyghurs in China might be understood.
Mm.
Easy one
Okay, those
for
are
you there.
excellent questions. Those are excellent questions. On Russian influence, I think we can if you take a long approach to this, I would argue that Russian influence is gradually decreasing on a cultural level. I think it's indisputable. Um, Already in many of these states, the moment you leave the capital, you don't have Russia as a lingua franca anymore. I think a lot of people going to Central Asia thinking that they can use Russian and get by everywhere are suddenly realizing that that's not working. The national languages, of course, are becoming the absolutely central. modes of communication in these countries. I don't see that being replaced. I'm not saying that Turkish will take over. I do think that a growing understanding of Turkish is expanding because of the popularity of Turkish television. But that doesn't mean that everybody's going to start speaking Turkish. What does it mean in terms of Russia's ability to hinder? I think there is still in some parts of these societies an ability of Russia and Russian propaganda. We've seen this with the how populations have reacted to the Ukraine war. That is, you can see depending on which medium you follow, which tends to be generational. The younger people tend to not watch television as much, and not certainly not watch Russian television as much. They have been much less amenable to see Russia's perspective or take it for granted, whereas older generations and those that rely on television, and particularly Russian language television, have been a lot more willing to accept Russia's definition of the conflict. So I think the same thing will happen here. I think you will find people who have a certain nostalgia for the brotherhood of the Soviet Union. They will have a difficulty embracing the new brotherhood of Turkic peoples. I think among youth, I think it will be a lot more uh, uh, of interest to a lot of young people across the region. And therefore, with every year that passes, my answer would be that Russia's ability to obstruct is going to go down, which is one of the reasons this is happening today and didn't happen 30 years ago. Now, moving on to the role of Tatarstan, this is something I deliberately did not include in the paper because I think we don't know. First of all, and I think that okay, let me put it this way. It is obvious that a growing institutionalization of Turkic language cooperation will have implications for the Turkic population of other states. This could be the Gagauz in Moldova. This could be, Turkic speakers in Germany or Sweden, where, Uzbeks and Kazakhs and Turks may not, and Azerbaijanis may make common cause in various ways. We've already seen this happening to some extent in diaspora communities. I think it will have at most an indirect effect in the near future because these countries understand perfectly that they have absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose from to in any way uh, operate, if you will, in relationship to Tatarstan or Bashkortostan, or making that an issue within the Turkic States Organization. I think the only possibility in which this could be, and the exception to this would be if it happened with Russian participation or Russian acceptance, which kind of would go against the idea of the Organization of Turkic States. I mean, you probably could see a scenario in which Russia itself would advance the idea, that first of all, Russia has expressed interest in becoming some form of, has some kind of relationship with this organization. I don't think it's a, I don't think it's a coincidence that it's written in the charter that only, countries with Turkic language as an official language can be members. Now, could Russia advance the idea that Tatarstan would be an observer? That would be possible, but I think the initiative would probably have to come from Russia. In the longer term, however, I think it's obvious that the role of Tatarstan, if Turkic cooperation succeeds and goes very much further, the questions will arise, well, what about us? But I don't think I can go any further than that. That also, like you said, cuts directly how to the second question, and I think it's a little early to answer what this means for Turkic minority states. There's a similar, I mean, the inverse question is what does it mean for non-Turkic minority populations inside of the region, whether they be Kurds, Russians in Kazakhstan, or others, Tajiks in Uzbekistan, if the Turkic identification becomes close to a national ideology. So I think that's probably what we can say today.
Great. Okay, so turning a bit to Russia, I'm going to collect three questions here. The first is Ambassador Daniel Rosenblum, former U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, who says, my perception based on time spent in the region is that Russia feels especially threatened by the OTS, seeing their regional influence and interest directly challenge as OTS has become more active and cohesive. What has been Russia's response so far, and what are they likely to do in the future?
Mhm.
Similarly, I think that you really cover and document them. And we heard in the beginning the military cooperation and defense industry development across the OTS that's been happening without Russian involvement and given Russia's role as security provider in Central Asia for a long time, it seems like potentially a big deal flying under the radar. Like, what does Putin think, or is he just not paying attention when he sees Turkish drones produced in Kazakhstan? And we have from James Preston, isn't the key recent advance in the OTS for member countries the cooperation on security and military technology, including Turkey's? So kind of trying to bridge those three together.
Yeah. Um, and those are great questions. The interesting part about Russia's reaction has been that there has been so little of a reaction. The only one I'm really aware of that's out in the public is the interest to engage with the OTS in some format. And this obviously goes back, if you go back 20 years, and those of you who know about Central Asian cooperation would know that the Russians under Putin realized that, well, we can first become an observer in the Central Asian Cooperation Organization, and then we can become a full member, and then we can either close it down or merge it into one of the organizations we control. Um, my general sense is that's not going to happen here. And the other one is really what leverage Russia has, because what we see both with Central Asian cooperation and with Turkic cooperation is that there is strength in numbers. Why do great powers want to divide and rule? There's a reason for that, because it's much easier for them to control smaller countries if they divide and rule. But when these states band together, it's much more difficult for an outside power, even a state with the power differential that Russia has compared to these countries, or China for that matter. Even for them, it becomes a lot more difficult to just get your way when you can play out these little countries against each other. So now, well, some of them are, and the other point is some of them are not little countries. Kazakhstan has a large economy. Uzbekistan has a very large population, and these are serious states. And if you look back at the past year, we've seen in the relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia, maybe there is no coincidence that Azerbaijan was targeted by Russia in the way it was, because it has been behaving in a way that Russia found objectionable. And Azerbaijan did not, fold. Rather, it raised the stakes. The Azerbaijanis raised the stakes with the Russians and responded to the Russians in ways that I haven't seen any country in this part of the world do, with the exception of the likes of Georgia and Ukraine, who paid a dear price for it. In the case of Azerbaijan, however, it ended rather in Dushanbe with a meeting between Aliyev and Putin, where they somehow came to an agreement to restore their relationship. As far as I can see, Azerbaijan has not paid a price. Quite to the contrary, maybe we're exaggerating what the Russians are willing and able to do to respond to this. If this turns into a serious force that is not impeded by a change in power in some of the countries or what have you, maybe there isn't that much they can do without creating consequences for themselves, especially in the relationship with Turkey, that they are not willing to pay. And it seems to me that if you could draw an analogy with how China has expanded its footprint in Central Asia, the Russians are pragmatic. They've understood that there's nothing we can do to stop this. And at the end of the day, it's not the West, right? And that perhaps is the main point for the Russians, that if the West is encroaching in our territory, it's something different. That's what they saw with Ukraine. That's what they saw with Georgia. And that's also because the Russian leadership at the end of the day is more than anything else interested in regime security. If you will, changes of government in Ukraine and Georgia that made those countries more European, more democratic, more liberal, was perceived in Russia clearly as a threat to regime security down the road. If you have a prosperous democratic Ukraine, why should Russians have what they have? Turkic cooperation is not a threat to the regime security of Putin or anybody in the Russian state. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why Turkey, just like China, or I should say not just Turkey, but Turkey cooperation, Central Asian cooperation, or Turkey and China as outside powers can have a role in this region without attracting the kind of response from Russia that a Western, especially American, footprint in this region would do.
Great. So I have four questions on the role of Islam in the OTS. So I'm going to read those for you. And then the next set of questions is about Northern Cyprus. So, James Chen, it appears that most of the OTS member states are majority Muslim with some exceptions. Does religion play any factor in the OTS's activity? And Turgul Keskin, how does the AKP era fusion of pan-Islamism and pan-Turkism differ conceptually from the earlier pan-Turkist projects in Central Asia? Also from him, or her, what are the long-term implications of Turkish involvement in religious education and clergy training for Central Asian secular governance? And how does the pan-Islamist pan-Turkism intersect with China's security concerns in Xinjiang?
Okay, thank you. Let me take the last question because I forgot to respond to the earlier one that involved the Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. In here, I think the Central Asian states are very pragmatic and know that this is the first, second, and third priority for China. And whether they like it or not, China is a key power that they cannot really do without, and they cannot antagonize. So they're going to be very careful not to, in any way, antagonize China on anything relating to the Uyghur issue. Going to the first part, which was the role played by religion, I see religion only playing a role as a marker of identity in the OTS. Um, there have been, as we know, very large differences um, in foreign policy orientations toward many issues in the Middle East. Turkey, of course, has been extremely um, activist in terms of the Gaza war. The Azerbaijanis, on the other hand, are heavily tied to Israel, and Kazakhstan just joined the Abraham Accords. So I think there is an agreement to disagree on these issues, which, by the way, is a very good example of how Turkey's role is not one of domination over this region, because then you would have seen OTS pass resolution after resolution on the Gaza issue condemning Israel. I haven't seen that happen. Um, so I think religion plays a role as a commonality of these states. There are differences, of course, Azerbaijani being Shia majority. Going into the question of religious education, we've seen that that's been a problem over the years, mainly because of the role of the Gulen movement in this region, which was the place from which the Gulen movement went from being regional to being global, and where Turkey for a while was advocating for everybody to allow Gulen to open schools, and then came back 5 years later and told them to close all the schools. So it's been kind of a little confusing for some of these states. I would say that overall, the leaders of the region are much more comfortable with the interpretation of Islam coming from Turkey compared to the one coming from the Middle East or from South Asia. And that remains the case, even though the AKP is a party built on an Islamist tradition, but I would say that has clearly, quote unquote, given up. I think this is a totally separate question, but my sense is that the Erdogan and his allies had a vision of Islamizing Turkey, whereas under his leadership, Turkish population, especially the youth, is more secular than ever. This is one of the reasons why they've, in defeat of their Islamist agenda, turned increasingly into what the questioner calls the pan-Islamic, pan-Turkist merger of ideologies, if you will. In that sense, I think if you look, for example, when Kazakhstan started its attempt to have religious training for imams, they did it together with the Egyptians, which I think raised some eyebrows in certain places, introducing a form of Islam from the Arab world that is very different from the traditional one that is very Sufi in the Central Asian region. The Turkish interpretation of Islam is a lot more compatible. Even in places like Kyrgyzstan, you've seen organizations with Tabligh Jamaat coming from South Asia, from Pakistan, having a large impact on the country's society. I think a lot of people there would rather see a Turkish influence than a South Asian or an Arab influence. So in that sense, I think there is no illusions, but there is also a sense that this is something they can manage. Um, as far as the interesting question on the pan-Islamic or the AKP ideology, whatever that is, because it changes over time, with the earlier pan-Turkism, I don't see it as being really uh, having much of a. Well, let me put it this way. I think the concept of Turkic cooperation, the concept of Turkic identity is broad enough that every state can define it the way they want it. Turkey can define it one way, Azerbaijan can define it in probably the most enthusiastic way, and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks can define it in their way. So it means that in Turkey, the motivation for engaging in Turkey cooperation may be different and may, in the rhetoric of the leadership, be more infused with Islamic color, if you will, than it definitely would be in Azerbaijan or even in or Kazakhstan. In fact, today I would say that Uzbekistan is probably the least resistant to a more religious spicing of the Turkic identity. But I don't think anybody sees religion as a central part of the identity. And in Central Asia and in Azerbaijan, where people were very alarmed by the years when the Erdogan government was turning into a heavy Muslim Brotherhood-oriented Islamist foreign policy, they see a sea change compared to those years into something that they feel relatively comfortable with.
Great. All right. To turn over to the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus,
Yeah.
the question we have from Ono Sero from Ramon Lul University is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus has been admitted as an observer to the OTS. What is the added value of this membership for the TRNC? Is it effective? Can it help solve the Cyprus conflict? I would just add from the reverse, as you say in the paper, it's created tensions potentially within the EU, even though the Central Asian states uh, reaffirmed their support for Cypriot territorial integrity, and they take those kind of concerns quite seriously. Um, how do you see them navigating this going forward? And even how would a dispute between Turkey and Greece end up being discussed at certain, like, could maybe you could expand a bit on how
Mm,
it might be discussed at Central Asian summits and the ways in which organizations actually function over particular disputes like this, versus
mm.
how we maybe think they should.
Interesting. Well, I don't know how they would operate in terms of a dispute. What I can say is that it's obvious that the initiative for the inclusion of the TRNC is Turkey. This is a priority for Turkey in terms of raising the stakes in the issue of Cyprus. Obviously, this has not been well received by the EU. I think there is a sense among the other members of the OTS, on the one hand, what you mentioned, the relationship with the EU is very important to them. The relationship with Turkey is very important to them. So how do you square the circle? You have the Turkish Cypriot representatives as an observer, but at the same time, which by the way, having them as an observer is not that strange because they are represented in one way or another around the world, and their passports are accepted in the EU and in the United States, for example. Um, but you make sure that you redouble your relationships with the Greek government of Cyprus as a way of assuaging any concerns on their part and of that of the EU. Because if the government of Cyprus doesn't perceive this as a huge issue, neither will the EU. That being said, I think there is also a sense or a historical experience, namely that everybody knows what happened in 2004 when there was a vote put to the Turkish and Greek communities on the island, and that would have solved the conflict once and for all. And the Greeks voted yes, voted no, and the Turks voted yes. And as a reward for scuttling the UN plan, the Greek government of Cyprus was included in the EU because the Greeks threatened to veto the entire EU expansion if they didn't. And therefore, the EU said, okay, well, we're not going to hold the entire expansion to Central and Eastern Europe hostage. We're going to take in the Greeks, a lot of the Greek Cyprus, and a lot of people regret that today because the way the Greek Cypriots have been making this a perennial issue and raising this at every possible level within EU institutions. So I think in Central Asia there is a sense of, well, the EU is not entirely blameless here, and therefore, we're going to go to a certain extent to compensate for this and to assure of our respect for territorial integrity. But I don't think they're, I don't, I think they see this is not our problem, you know. I think that seems to me to be the way that the Central Asians look at this. And this is for something for others to deal. How they would agree with this, I think it's there's an interesting video somewhere out when Azerbaijan and the President Aliyev welcomed a Greek ambassador. He made it publicly. He said, Turkey is our brother country. We will side with Turkey on every issue. And that said, we hope to have good relations with you." I think that sums up how these issues are likely to be treated by the other states in the OTS.
Thanks so much. Okay, so moderator's prerogative for the last two questions that we didn't touch on that I want to hear from you and or double click on. Number one, the bureaucratic structure challenge from the US and EU. So you mentioned this in your opening remarks, that Western Europe, EU, US split the responsibility for Turkey, Central Asia. From your interactions with policymakers, do you see any signs that bureaucratic structures are adapting to the reality of the OTS? Or are these organizational challenges really hindering Western understanding and engagement? And number two, maybe you could just talk a little bit about alphabet politics. You talk a lot
Mm,
about Kazakhstan's decision to adopt the Latin alphabet. So, what does that sort of choice communicate that other forms of
mhm.
cooperation maybe don't?
Good, thank you. So, on the what was the gist of the first question again? That was about the
Be how Western bureaucratic structures
bureaucracy.
are
Yes, yes. Okay, so the
hindering their
quick answer to that is I think it's not just about the OTS, it's in general how we conceptualize this part of the world. It was the same when we were looking at Afghanistan, it's the same when we look at Mongolia. We have an understanding of Central Asia as being five stand countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. We got to get rid of this way of looking at the world because it's so much more interconnected and so much more complex. Look at Central Asian cooperation. Now they've included Azerbaijan. In the past, they included President Ghani of Afghanistan in their meetings. People are talking about how do we include Mongolia in terms of understanding of Central Asia. Same with the OTS. We just have, and our bureaucratic institutions have not adapted at all. I think this is a huge problem in how we view the world. I don't know, you can probably find out 20 different ways of reorganizing it, but we have a bureaucratic boundaries that don't conform with the realities of present day politics in this region. And it might be true in other regions, but particularly here, because we were stuck in Soviet defined understanding of the world that's really not applicable anymore. As for alphabets, that's a kind of nice segue into this because now you're seeing that one of the big things in the cultural area that the OTS has done is to build a common Turkic alphabet. And if you've ever studied Uzbek, for example, you have a lot of apostrophes, and you've seen in terms of in Kazakhstan, there have been different proposed alphabets of Kazakhs that have been controversial for a variety of reasons. Now, these different countries have worked together in order to bring about a simple, relatively simple, there are many letters, but relatively simple Turkic common alphabet that incorporates all the sounds in these different Turkic languages and that are gradually, I think, going to be rolled out across these countries. So you might see an alphabet reform in Uzbekistan at some point. It gets rid of these alphabets and gets closer to the common Turkic alphabet. Kyrgyzstan is still the the country that hasn't taken the big step of moving into Latin. I suspect at some point in the future that will happen when everybody else has, but we're not there yet.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, we come to the end of our hour. I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Cornell, for your time. And thank you very much to the audience for the excellent engagement and questions. And I hope you all will join us at our next webinar. And with that, have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.